This is Palm Sunday, the beginning of a week in which those who are traditional Christians think a great deal about the meaning of their faith. But even in our very secular society, with the naming of a new pope in Rome, religion has come back into the headlines. Bang, boom. They're on the news every night. And I find that his naming raises all kinds of questions about theology. Although, interestingly, for me, the most important theological question there is not about so much the traditional theology debated within the Roman Catholic Church. It's about the nature or even the existence of God. Karen Armstrong, who is within that Catholic faith, although she is not particularly favored by the Pope, says that despite our scientific and technological brilliance these days, our religious thinking is remarkably undeveloped. She says that in some respects, the way people think about God today is like the way people did in remote antiquity, when they had theologies that they found they either had to jetson or radically reinterpret because they just didn't fit the realities of the world in which they found themselves. In fact, that is behind the evolution of all of today's major religions. They came into being because people in the pre-modern world found it very difficult to speak about God. And I suspect the same thing is true for a lot of us. It certainly was for me. Though I've always thought of myself as an intensely religious person, I've long struggled with the kind of God in which the Pope and so many others seem to believe. The kind of God who knows and cares about each and every one of us as individual persons. I remember in my early 20s in college, talking long into the night with whoever would listen about how hard it was to believe in God. It may seem strange for someone who'd later decide to go into the ministry to have questions like this, but if ever there were people who should wrestle with the idea of God, it's ministers, since we're supposed to know something about it. In my own case, though I was raised in a mainline Christian church, a liberal arts college, and a lack of any feeling of connections with God, the kind of God at least talked about in the church I attended, made it impossible for me to believe in the kind of God in which I was supposed to believe. A God to whom we could appeal for help, for whatever it is that we want out of life, whether it's freedom from disease, or a person who will love us, or money. As I became older, it became clearer and clearer that whatever I wanted out of life, I was going to have to achieve on my own. God wasn't going to do it for me. But in spite of the absence of a conventional God in my life, I liked churches, particularly UU churches, just like Sally described, because of what they could do for people. So I decided to apply to seminary, and after a couple of tries, I actually got through. And while I was in school, I learned most of what I understand about theology from a pair of mid-20s, newly minted professors fresh from Harvard. You know, if you're from Harvard, you're really supposed to know everything. And both of these guys had been teaching assistants for Paul Tillich, who was the most famous and probably most respected American theologian at that time. And Tillich had just published his systematic theology. Systematic theologies are tomes in which theologians sum up what it is they believe about God and religion and the church. And trying to understand what this guy Tillich wrote was hard. I hadn't gone to Harvard. But the task was made even more challenging by the fact that not only did Tillich seem to have changed his mind about what he thought from when he began writing that systematic, my profs disagreed about whether, even in the beginning, Tillich believed in God. One prof said that Tillich clearly believed in a deity that he called the ground of being or ultimate concern. After all, he used capital letters for them. The other said that no matter what the words he used, Tillich believed that if there was a God, whatever it was beyond our knowing. In fact, this prof said, Tillich believed that even using the word God was idolatrous, as did our ancient Jewish ancestors, who forbid each other from saying the word God out loud when they worshiped. When they came to that word in the text, they just let it go blank, because they believed that the word for God wasn't God, whatever God was. Okay. You may say, I understand that, but does that mean that the divine isn't something with which we can have a relationship? I happen to believe, like the author of this morning's children's story, that whatever it is that's sacred and holy is something we can experience, just like the girl did in that book. But I don't believe whatever it is that's sacred and holy is some kind of white bearded guy up above this roof in the sky. Something that knows what's going on in our lives and cares about us as individuals. Given the billions of light years worth of existence out of which we've evolved, along with everything else that's here in the universe, it seems rather egocentric to believe that there's some all-knowing something that's aware of us. And yet, there have been times in my life, like the girl, when I felt a relationship with something that goes beyond describing. Something sacred and holy that's in and around us. And feeling that way, Karen Armstrong says that rather than believing in some kind of traditional theology, it's having feelings like this that makes one religious. She talks about how a musician losing herself in her music feels like she's in another world. How a dancer caught up in his dance becomes inseparable from it. Or how a skier, feeling entirely at one with himself and the world, soars in the air and feels like she's touching the face of God. One of the reasons people created the symbols and the rituals and the stories of religion was to help them experience life like this. Even though that's not the way most people these days, including the Pope, seem to think about religion. Most people expect religion to put them in touch with a God who's going to take care of what they can't take care of for themselves. For a God to be a kind of a superhuman parent who hasn't yet kicked us out of the nest. But that's not what God is. In Forest Church, one of the most insightful UU ministers of recent times, who died, unfortunately, of esophageal cancer, also not too long ago, faced the implications of what, in spite of all the medical help he could find, and he was a famous person and he lived in Manhattan, so he found the best help there was. He found that he had an incurable disease and there was no longer anything he could do about it. So in the face of that, he thought a lot about God and religion. And though he had long ago rejected the idea of a deity that would be able to do miraculous things, like curing him of his disease, he told an interviewer that one of the things that sustained him in the face of his impending death was his relationship with whatever it was that was sacred and holy. Church said, I don't pray for miracles. I don't pray God will cure me of my incurable cancer. What he prayed for, said Church, was the courage to be able to receive and consecrate each day that I'm given as a gift, as did the girl in this morning's story. Church said, I have no idea what happens after we die. So I go with Henry David Thoreau, who when asked about the afterlife said, Madam, I prefer to take it one life at a time. When the interviewer pursued Church about the relationship that he believed he had with this whatever it was that was sacred and holy, he said he believed it was the kind of loving spirit that was affirmed by our universalist ancestors, a spirit that was a source of grace and power that's available to anyone who's open to it. He went on to equate this with a divine love that is the light that's meant to shine through every religious window, no matter what the pictures in those windows might be. He went on to say that this light is the light of a love that is not only there for us, but can shine through us to others. The greatest of all truths, said Church, is that love never dies, that every act of love that we perform in this life is carried on and is passed on into another life, so that centuries from now, our love endures. It's a wonderful kind of immortality. And helping us understand this, says Church, is the work of religion. The work of religion is not how to gain God's favor. It's how to live in ways that will redeem the day. What his universalist faith taught him, says Church, is that even in the face of God, our task is to unwrap the present and to receive it as the gift that it is. You walk through the valley of the shadow, he says, and you find that it's riddled with light. Forrest Church didn't lead a perfect life. Being a minister doesn't guarantee that a person's going to be a saint. I'm sure not one. But he was the son of thoughtful and compassionate parents who taught him to take life seriously. At the same time, they surrounded him with their love. So he lived their kind of life. He not only excelled in college, he went on to get a ministerial degree right here in the Bay Area, and then he earned a PhD in religion and went on to become one of our foremost UU ministers and scholars, a kind of contemporary Emerson. And in doing this, he was a lot like Karen Armstrong. She had similar credentials. She was both an academic and a nun. And Armstrong was similar to Church in trying to discover from where it was that all these ideas of religion had come. And she came to the conclusion that they hadn't come from some revelation from God given to one another prophet in ancient times, or even today, if we're to say, believe the Mormons. She came to the conclusion that they had come from the need of human beings to acknowledge and to be in touch with something beyond themselves and to figure out how to live an ethical life. Throughout human history, people have made use of their imaginations in this task to create rituals and symbols and stories to help them with it. Armstrong says religion's task is to help us with the realities for which we have no easy explanations and the problems we can't easily solve, like mortality and pain and grief and despair and outrage at all the injustice and cruelty that surrounds us. Trying to help people deal with such things lies at the heart of religion. Religions have been created to help us to come to grips for things with which reason and science can't provide all the answers, like the terror and the disappointment and the sorrow that come from finding, as did church, that you've got an incurable disease. What helped church, he said, wasn't a belief that if he said the right things or took part in the appropriate rituals, God was going to help him get rid of that disease. What helped him deal with this reality was not the promise of some God-given miracle. It was a universalist faith that called him to break out of the prison of selfhood and to show love in a way that would free him from being bound by his disease. In doing this, he didn't want people to feel sorry for him. He wanted to show them that his approaching death wasn't going to deprive him of his ability to love. May the discipline of our Unitarian Universalist faith, no matter what the words we use for what's sacred and holy, help us to discover deep down what it is that we want to be, the kind of loving person that church found redeemed the situation in which he found himself. Let us live the kind of lives that will let the light of love shine through us so it can find an immortality.